Well, it's 6:30, so we're going to start. This is the panel on legal things for FGC players to know. My name's David Graham, aka Ultra David. I am a commentator in fighting games and have been for many years, but on top of that, I am also an attorney. Been practicing since 2011. I do and have done esports law, so for players and teams and organizers and broadcasters and basically all the sides of it. In addition to sort of general contract law, oftentimes in gaming and entertainment.
And I'm Ryan Fairchild, and I have been practicing since 2016. I don't have like a second name. I don't have.
You got to get on that.
No, I do. Probably the closest thing is Fair Play Esports, which is my Twitter handle. I largely do business law and litigation, but have started working in esports since about 2017, largely on the player side. I've also done some teamwork as well, and otherwise enjoy playing video games and have for a long, long time.
For sure. So we both do player contracts, and we've been advising players. Yeah, I'm not sure this is working that well. You're, yeah, okay.
Can you all hear me?
Oh yeah, you got to hold it really close.
All right, I just got to get closer.
Yeah.
All right, there we go.
Cool.
I'm not going to reintroduce myself.
No, Ryan Fairchild. So we're going to just be talking a little bit about some advice for players, and we're going to be, in general, looking at it in a couple of different ways. One is through the lens of, are you trying to compete? Just competing? The other one is a little bit more expansive. It's more with an eye to creating a brand and what you may do, or what you may need from a content creator perspective.
And also, just to kick this off, because we are lawyers, we want to give a disclaimer. Like, we're not intending to give any specific legal advice here to your particular situation. If you need specific legal advice, talk to us about that or find a lawyer to talk to. We also aren't going to cover everything necessarily, so this is not exhaustive. And we're also, I'm licensed in North Carolina, you're licensed in California.
California.
And so we give advice, when we do give specific advice, specific to those jurisdictions, and we hedge on those fronts as well.
Yeah, for sure. So like I said, we're going to be talking about this in a couple of broad ways. We're going to be briefly addressing contracts and intellectual property, IP, and rights related there too. We're going to talk a little bit about entity creation. Yeah, so anyway, let's begin, start riffing.
And I want to just preface this. David, you've been in the FGC for longer than you've been practicing law, right?
Definitely, yeah. I've been in the FGC since 2002.
Okay, and when you started in 2002 to now, how has the landscape changed legally?
Well, there wasn't a landscape legally, is the answer. There wasn't a landscape legally until probably late 2000s. The first person who was really sponsored in any meaningful kind of way was Justin Wong. And, I guess really it was Marn, but shortly thereafter it was Justin. And that happened in, I want to say, 2009 or 10 that he joined EG. Before that, there were teams, certainly, but there was no, there wasn't any kind of framework for teams that I think we would recognize today. There were clans, I think maybe you would say more accurately. And so there were never contracts, as far as I'm aware. There was nothing ever like that. There were tournaments that were run, and so they needed some kind of legal work, I'm sure, but that was, if they had lawyers at all, it was lawyers who were just dealing with whatever the venue was, whatever the contracts related to that were. It wasn't anything that you would call FGC law or esports law in any sense until just even more recently than that. When I began practicing in 2011, there really wasn't, even at that time, any money in it, certainly as a lawyer. I mean, that was, and still is, I know for both of us, a lot of it is just pro bono work, just helping people out. Because the legal market is not, certainly was not at all existent, now is a little bit more.
Yeah, particularly in the FGC, I think. Yeah. And contracts from when they did exist and as you've seen them, like if you had to rate them on a terribleness scale of 1 to 10, like 10 being like, we finally have, this is a good contract, okay, well negotiated both sides. Uh-huh. 1 being like, we could lock the player in prison if we wanted to. Like, where have you seen them get to on average?
I've seen them start at probably about a 2 or a 3. So, we're talking about individual pages.
So a camp maybe, but not prison.
A camp, okay. Now I would say it's much, much better.
Yeah.
Much better. So when we talk about team contracts, I think at this point we have a good idea of how they should look. We have a good idea of how they commonly look, even on top of what they should look like. I think that usually in the FGC now, contracts are effective. They're rarely something that you could just say should be voidable or whatever. They're rarely like that now. I think we're in a much better place, and moving forward, I expect that trend to continue.
Great. All right. Thanks for that background too. So as David said, we want to talk a little bit about how things would look if you're a competitor, and then how they might look differently if you're focusing on content creation. But ideally, you should be trying to do both, because I use this analogy a lot. Michael Jordan was a basketball player, but he leveraged that platform in the competition side to sell hamburgers and underwear and sneakers, and made a lot more money doing those things ultimately than he did competing as a basketball player. So there's going to be a lot of overlap between those two things. So what we want to do is sort of take you through the journey, maybe the life cycle of a competitive player into a content creator, and talk about the legal issues along the way.
So for that, let's kind of start with the idea that you are a player who is approaching teams. You're trying to find somebody who can be your team sponsor, or whatever you want to call it. And so how do you get to that stage in the first place?
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about sort of marketing yourself, what is it that you may need in order to do that?
Yeah, so I have players who might be looking for a team, or who are in between teams, and they want to try to pitch themselves, and they'll ask me, hey, can you go talk to these teams? And I'll say, all right, well, what do I tell them about you? Like, can you put together a one-pager, especially maybe hire a graphic designer, put together a one-pager of your recent placements, of your social media following, your impressions, things like that. And also, you need to, when you go at them, show what value you're going to bring beyond those things. What are you doing in terms of content creation? How are you in front of a camera? What are your people skills? There's a lot more that goes into getting a contract that I think is vital. It's almost more important than the contract is how you approach the team, and then also how you vet them.
When you are thinking about what a team is looking for, it's not just somebody to win a tournament, right? It's somebody who will help them expand their brand, or help them reach new eyeballs in terms of advertising. Somebody who can be out there and who can sort of bring people into the team, or into the awareness of whatever the team is trying to sell in terms of sponsors and the like. So it's more expansive. Obviously, placings is a big part of that, right? For sure. Because if you're on stream more often, you're going to be seen more often, naturally. But on top of that, if you are able to build, a good Twitch stream, a good YouTube channel, anything like that. We'll talk more about content creation, but if you have that sort of stuff, then you are more attractive to a team already.
Yeah, for sure. Ultimately what teams are trying to do is attract sponsors.
Yeah.
It's a marketing play in most cases, both for the game publishers and for the teams. So if you can help them to market, that's what they're looking for. And it's either through that competitive side where you're on stream, or through that content creation side and the platform side.
When you're reaching out, it's important to be professional, of course. You want to start your relationship off, if there is going to be a relationship, in a professional kind of way. And so you need to look for who the appropriate person is to email, or DM, or call, or whatever it is in the first place. This is like maybe a bigger deal than people might imagine. It's a little off-putting to teams if somebody doesn't know what the path should be, or if they are kind of what some members of some teams may view as being kind of bothering them, that to be avoided for sure.
Yeah, I think you want to do research. It's like any job interview, right? Like, you don't go into a job interview cold. You want to do some research on the entity. You want to know, all right, do they have a team manager that I go through, or do they have a director of esports? Who is the person? And what tone do I use when I reach out to them too?
Yeah, and you said it earlier when you said that you need to vet the team as well. So it's not just that you want the team to know about you, you need to know about the team, and you need to, ask players who have been on the team or who are on the team, is this a good set of folks? How has it been in terms of payment? Have they sent you around to all the events that they said they were going to? Have they otherwise breached the agreement in any way? Are they backing you up? You know, are they helping you out on social media? Whatever the contract says, are they doing those things? Sometimes you'll find that the answer is no, and you don't want to be part of the team if that's true.
Yeah, ultimately, like a contract only gets you so far. I would much rather have a more bare bones contract and have a really good team behind it than a really good contract with a questionable team behind it. So that vetting portion is vital, honestly.
Definitely, and you know, when it comes to negotiations or whatever, not even just negotiations, but you're dealing with the team, you're approaching the team, make sure that this stuff is in writing, to the extent that it helps you out. You don't want to just rely on an oral offer. You don't want to just rely on something that's a handshake. That kind of thing can create a contract that's legally binding, but it's just harder to prove. And so if you instead have it written, if you have it, say that you have had a conversation with somebody at a team, maybe go back and then send them an email saying, here's what we discussed, just to memorialize it, to make it clear that here's my understanding of how things went. If the person disagrees, then they'll say in an email. But if they don't, then they've sort of assented to your telling of the events, right?
This is the best piece of legal advice that lawyers give generally, I think, which is get it in writing. If it's going to protect you, get it in writing. The first thing I ask when players come to me saying, I have a problem with the team, they said they were going to do this, now they're doing this, I'll ask them, did you get it in writing? Do you have that recorded in a conversation anywhere? Is it on Discord? Is it in a Twitter DM? Is it in an email? Like, because that's what you're going to rely on when things go wrong, is that writing. That's the first and most fundamental line of defense. If you don't have that, we can't even get into the other things really. We could, but it's, as David said, it's going to be much more difficult.
For sure. Now, say that you have found a team, and you like the team likes you, you have received a contract offer. What are you looking for in that agreement?
There are a lot of different pieces, and we're going to go through a lot of them, but I want to be clear on what a contract is first and what a contract isn't, because people come to me and they say, I have a contract, and they're not doing what it says in the contract. Why aren't they doing what it says in the contract? A contract is what the expectations of the parties are when they're entering into that agreement. And you're trying to cover sort of, if anything goes wrong, how do we proceed? The problem is, especially when they're smaller money values, teams still breach all the time, unfortunately. Players still breach as well. And unless you're willing to enforce it and go to court about it or arbitration or whatever the enforcement is, the contract is just kind of a bunch of words about what you expected to do when you got into it. And now you run into a situation that maybe you didn't anticipate, or maybe now the parties aren't willing to follow through on that. So, well, they can be given force in a court of law. It still depends on you getting it all the way to that point, getting a final judgment, getting that enforced, collecting. There's a whole bunch of steps as well that make it difficult. But the good part of the contract is you can set forward those expectations, and you can go back to it with the team and say, hey, you promised to do this, and hopefully they follow through with it. Hopefully you follow through with it.
Yeah, I tell clients not to think of contracts as being like a computer program that you sort of agree to, right? And it tells the computer what to do, and it just happens. You press go on the thing and it does the thing, right? It is not something that's automatic in that sense. To have force, if there is a problem, like you said, there's a whole process that you have to go through, and that's not easy. So it is better to think of the contract as being more of the groundwork for how the relationship should go. Ideally, the relationship is well expressed, and you know exactly what's expected of you. You know all the obligations that you have to do. You know what the team is expected to do. You know how you're going to get paid. You know when the team's going to make money. You know all these little relationships, because that's really what you have. It's a just sort of a codification of a business relationship. It's really what it is.
Yeah. I do also want to say litigation generally is very expensive. One option I've been telling, in particular FGC players to consider, especially if they're located wherever their team is consider small claims court. You can go there yourself, you can do it especially if you have a writing that says they were supposed to pay you, and you have records of your payments, and then they stop and they haven't paid you through a certain date. You can go through that. You can try to get a judgment from a magistrate. It won't always work. Sometimes the magistrate will dismiss it and you have to appeal to district court, which is going to be more expensive. But there are mechanisms where you could at least make the team sweat, or you could get some extra leverage as well. And I think that actually FGC players and esports players right now are probably undervaluing small claims just because they're sort of intimidated by it.
So okay, say that you've gotten this contract. The first thing that I want you to look at is to make sure that it's appropriate for your situation in sort of a broad way. It's very common that I'll check out a player's contract and it's somebody who's a Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat player or whatever, but the contract is for somebody on League of Legends teams or somebody in Overwatch. And while the contract won't say it's for Overwatch, it's written from a team perspective.
We can bench you.
Exactly right.
What does that mean in the FGC?
Right, I see this all the time that the team can bench a player, or that the team has managerial control over the team's, whatever the team is going to have.
Practice schedule.
Yeah, that practice schedule. These things aren't applicable to the FGC because we just have a different situation and we have 1v1 games. And so make sure that it is something that's appropriate. And a couple reasons for that. One is that it's obviously you want to make sure that the relationship, like we were just saying, is really detailed and you know exactly what the deal is, that the actual relationship between the parties is described as it should be. The other reason is that if the team is not willing to even alter their contracts to reflect the fact that it's a 1v1 sort of situation, if they're not willing to put in that small degree of work to actually reflect the situation, I don't know if that team is worth much. Like that to me is sort of a harbinger of other negative things to come.
Yeah, and that's a really important point as well. A lot of players get an offer, they get really excited. They're like, I'm gonna get my expenses paid, maybe get a little bit of salary on top of that, get some bonuses potentially built in there, and they jump at those offers without that vetting or without thinking about the red flag. It's like a relationship, right? You're getting in a relationship. You're starting to date somebody, there's some red flags, but you're really excited about it, and then eventually like it blows up and you're like, oh, I never saw this coming, when actually you did. So, those early things are important.
Definitely. I mean, to me, so okay, you've made sure that it is a 1v1 contract, it's for, a Blaze Blue player, whatever the game is that you play. And by the way, that was a little bit too specific. It shouldn't be that your contract says that you can only play Blaze Blue or you can only play Street Fighter. In the FGC, I don't want that kind of specificity. It just doesn't need to be like that. A lot of players play multiple games. A lot of us play multiple games, yeah, exactly right. So you don't need to have something that says that. You can say which game is your main, that's fine, but it shouldn't limit you to just that. All right, so you got that. Let's talk about the first thing, or one of the first things certainly that you should pay attention to, which is payment.
That's what everybody's excited about, right? Like, you get your contract, I'm gonna get paid to do this, I'm not a professional. Yeah, but all right, how much are they paying you? And you can negotiate these too. I mean, you should be coming to an agreement on these, right? Like, they'll offer you something and you're like, well, those are the terms. Like, you can negotiate these things. I think that's important to remember. How much are they paying you? What schedule are they paying you on? Do you have to invoice them for it? Because a lot of these things get built as independent contractor agreements instead of you're getting paid with a 1099 instead of a W-2. You can ask accountants more about that. I think also really important with payment is, there's one other thing I was thinking about. What else am I missing about payment?
What triggers the payment? I mean, like under what circumstances do you get paid? Well, not just invoicing, but there may be other things that have to exist for you to get the payment. Maybe you need to, I've seen that players need to have so many followers or so many hours streamed or whatever it may be for them to get a bonus that may be relevant for them. So there may be obligations that you need to meet in order to get paid. And make sure that whatever is in the contract reflects your actual discussion with the team. I've also certainly seen situations where a player's understanding is, I always ask the player, what is your understanding of the contract before I read the contract? Because I want to know whether it differs at all.
Yeah.
And sometimes players will say, well, my understanding is that I'm going to be getting paid X salary. And then I read, and it's actually X minus a lot salary. It's not the same at all. Sometimes there's no salary in the situations. So you have to make sure that as with all these things, that your understanding of the contract is actually in the contract.
I've run into lawyers on the other side of these negotiations where they'll come back to me with red lines, and I'm like, have you talked to your client about what they agreed to? Because they'll be pushing back on things as well. So you have to make sure everybody involved in the process really understands what the terms that were negotiated are. The one other thing I was thinking is payment method. So sometimes PayPal, direct deposit, you want to make sure that's pinned down as well. Are they handing you a sack of cash?
Yeah, again, you just want to be as precise as possible. You just want to know as much as you can about how that's going to happen.
So some other terms that come up besides just the straight monthly compensation or bonuses, sometimes you can get revenue share. So if there's merchandise, you could get a percentage of that. If there are other, we get this less with maybe in-game goods, but there is the potential that could happen as well. So you get champions costumes, for example, in Street Fighter. I don't know if they get a split of that. That would probably be with Capcom. But there's potential for teams to eventually do like in-game goods that, you get a particular skin for your character and you want to cut of that. You could get that as well or negotiate for that potentially. And you want to know, the most important thing for me, if you do get those revenue share categories, is know how they're calculating it, particularly the cost that they're going to take out to calculate like gross revenue or net profits, because sometimes they'll put in something like all other overhead costs. And I'm like, what does that mean? And teams will be like, well, it's whatever else we need to charge for. I'm like, no, what does that mean? Because otherwise you could be paying a consultancy fee to like your uncle as part of this, and all of a sudden all the profits are gone and my player doesn't get any percentage on that. So understanding what they're taking out and how that's calculated, getting an audit right maybe if you're concerned about that. Hopefully you're getting these things. You might not be getting these things at first, but hopefully those come along.
And more commonly than a rev share deal for somebody in the FGC is maybe that a team will want a percentage of your winnings. Not uncommon. Yeah. Less common, I think, than it once was. My experience is that when I began representing players 8 years ago or so, it was really common that teams would want the split. It then I felt became less common for a while, and now I feel that at the highest level it's becoming a little bit more common again. So there's definitely some kind of movement in how that goes, but pay attention to whether that exists in any contract that you might get. Ideally, as the player, you don't want that, right? You want to have all of your prize if you can. But if that's not possible, if they really, really want to have a split, then at least try to make it so that that split only applies above some certain amount of money. So if you win $50 at your local, that you don't owe them 20% of that, right? That's just a hassle for you. Is it even worth it to the team to send you an invoice and all that? They have to pay somebody to be doing those things. So that's something that you can typically try to carve out, is the ability to, at least if there is a split, if it's a percentage split, at least have it be above $1,000, $500, something, whatever you can get naturally.
Yeah, something reasonable. The one other thing, just because of a recent contract that I had, is watch out for what they want to extract from your portion of the prize pool as well. I've seen it where they want to, if they pay your expenses to go to a tournament, they want to recoup that from your prize pool. So just make sure you're aware of that. You know that that's going on. If you're okay with that, more to be aware of.
Let's talk about obligations, because oftentimes these contracts are not just about competition. They're not just about somebody going and entering into a tournament and trying to win. They're always about that, but they may also be about trying to make you show up at an event that may be related to a sponsor. It may be an appearance that you may have to engage in. It may be a set number of hours you have to stream per hour, per week, or per month. It may be how often you have to tweet something related to the team, or even just tweet or post on Facebook or Instagram or whatever it may be at all. There may be requirements for you to engage in YouTube content uploading. There may be other stuff than just playing.
Yeah, I think you covered it pretty well, but you want to know what you have to do. Because again, a lot of players think, again, what's your expectation of the contract? All right, I get paid X amount of money, I go show up at tournaments, they pay for the tournaments, and then you go into there and like, well, you have to do these 4 other things as well, and be aware of it. You have to stream 20 hours a week or something if you're not playing in a tournament that week, and all of a sudden they're like, wait, what? So...
Yeah, I mean, like for lots of players, until you're at the highest level, it's oftentimes players are doing this as a side job, if it's a job, right? It's a hobby, maybe that you're hoping is going to be a job. So you may have full-time work, and it may be impractical for you to also stream 20 hours a week, or whatever it may be. So just make sure that it's something that that's possible for you, that's in line with your expectations, that you can actually handle?
Yeah, so now we're going to talk about some things that are more exciting maybe for lawyers than the players, but are also very important. So we're going to talk about termination, and then IP rights in contracts as well. The term of the contract is how long it goes, but one of the things you really want to know is, does it auto-renew, and under what conditions? Is there a right of first refusal? What are the principal terms that they have to match if they're going to exercise that right of first refusal?
What's a right of first refusal?
All right, good point. All right, so the way I describe a right of first refusal is, think about the NBA, you have restricted free agents and unrestricted free agents. Restricted free agents can technically go out and shop another offer, but if they get another offer that they're willing to sign, they have to take it back to the team that they were with before and they can match it. That's basically what a right of first refusal is. You can go out and for the next 3 months after your contract ends, any offer you get, we can match. So
yeah, and what does it mean to match is the point of what you were saying before. So, always contemplated in that is how much you're going to get paid and how long it's going to last and something like that. But what if there are going to be, say you've found this contract that you really like, where you could also get bonuses, or maybe you could get some kind of support for your stream or whatever, your additional stuff. Is that included in what needs to be matched when it comes to right of first refusal? That's really something you have to pay attention to. You want to, if there is something like a right of first refusal in your contract, you just, again, with all of these things, as clear as possible, you want to understand it, you want to make sure you're not going to get caught off guard by anything, and you don't want to commit yourself to something that is overly restrictive for you.
It's interesting because when I first came into this space about 2 years ago, I saw salary, length of the contract, any incentive bonuses, any signing bonus, any performance incentives, and I've started to see those things actually pared back, where they just want to match, for example, how long the contract is and salary. And that makes it a lot more difficult for other teams to pull you away as well. And going back to what you said as well about starting to take more out of prize pools, I think a lot of teams, especially big teams that got investors, want to see more return.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to clamp down on those things. So if you're okay with it, you're okay with it, but know that you can negotiate these things. And you don't have to say yes to a contract if you don't reach a point where you're satisfied.
As far as the length goes, there's a huge variety. I mean, I've had contracts for players that are 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years. I mean, I don't know that I've seen longer than 3 years in a few years, but I mean, I have in the past, but we're talking about years ago. I don't know that I've seen anything that's longer than 3 years in the past few years. And the 1 3-year deal that I worked on was super fantastic, and we were stoked to get it.
Same. So. Yeah, the best deal I ever got for a player was actually outside the FGC, but it was a 3-year deal. They just had a CSGO deal that was 5 years, but that was the longest I'd heard about.
Dang, yeah, that is definitely, oh, I heard about that too, that's right. So okay, that's the length of contract, which is called the term, and then the termination is, how does it end? And so, it's very important to know what the conditions are for the for the contract to end, both for you and for the team, because you want to know whether the team can let you go, you want to know whether you can drop the team, or whether you're just stuck there.
And players get really excited. They're like, I have a year-long contract, and I'll ask them, how much does it say that? Well, how long does it give them to give you termination without cause? And they're like, oh, well, 2 weeks. And I'm like, that means you have a 2-week contract, really. Like, they can terminate you at any time for any reason, 2 weeks pay, and you're done. So one thing I often recommend to players is you don't have to, but consider giving up a little bit of salary to get more of your contract guaranteed. And that is a battle I fight a lot. And a lot of players just want to hope that it's going to work out okay, but think again about the stability of the organization, your situation. It's another factor to consider, at least.
I mean, I'm sure that there are situations that I know you guys all know about where suddenly a lot of players left teams very suddenly. I mean, that has happened, right? I'm sure you can think of some examples. Make sure that you can't just get let go whenever, right? And if the contract says that you can get let go without cause at any time, any kind of language like this, then that means that you aren't guaranteed to actually be with the team and make whatever salary the contract otherwise says that you should make.
Yeah.
So, it's just a cautionary tale. It's happened a lot.
And just again, like you said, you want to know how you can get out of the contract if it goes bad too, because oftentimes You won't be allowed to terminate without cause unless perhaps you negotiate a buyout amount. You could set that buyout amount beforehand, or you could just agree to negotiate it, which could be risky. You might want to get more termination for cause provisions in there. You know, if they don't pay you for a certain number of months, if XYZ happens, you can get that in there. Say, okay, I can terminate this for cause and get out of the contract.
And let's also talk about the notice period. If there is an auto renew, as you were talking about, one thing that you have to pay attention to is whether the contract will just automatically go for another year or whatever the period of time is. Well, if that is going to happen, how far before that auto renew do you have to let them know that you're not interested? Typically, it's like 30 or 60 days.
Which I think is too long, frankly.
Sometimes it's 90.
I've seen 90, and I think that's way too long.
I think that's crazy.
Yeah,
like, but that's not uncommon.
Yeah, 3 months out. Do we know how things are going to be going and whether or not we want to continue in this?
I hear you. So ideally, what you want is for no period, right? Yeah. You're probably not going to get that. But to have something that's short is, for sure, as the player, the better idea.
Or just not have auto renewal.
Or to not have auto renewal, of course, yeah. All right, so termination. Let's talk about these rights. Okay, so we're talking about IP rights now, your intellectual property rights as a player.
Let's start off with a horror story. I can't remember, I think it was Povelter in League of Legends. Don't quote me on the name, but there was a League of Legends player who assigned his likeness and image rights to a team exclusively and in perpetuity. What that meant was that every other contract he signed with another organization after that had to go back to that first organization and negotiate with them to get his likeness and image rights in order to use them for marketing. You really want to pay attention to what likeness and image rights you're giving up, what intellectual property rights you're giving up, both whether or not they're exclusive, which if they are exclusive, it should only be during the term of the contract. I wouldn't want it to be exclusive no matter what, especially if you stream, because if you stream, I'm sure that those Twitch agreements, you're assigning certain amounts of rights to them, and so if all of a sudden you've given it to the team for the term, then you could get in trouble.
Yeah, you definitely have to make sure that you're not giving multiple parties the same rights. That is a no-no, for sure. So pay attention to that. You do not, as you said, want to give them up in perpetuity. You don't want to give them exclusive rights. Sometimes that's required, and as long as definitely. So sometimes I've seen perpetuity apply to things that are made during the term. So say like a company, a team makes some kind of ad. You are, as the player, in the ad. They want to make sure that they can still use that ad in the future. I understand.
Yeah, or sort of tribute videos, or sort of like get hype videos where you're in, a split second of the, championship of whatever team.
Yeah. So pay attention to your rights. That is definitely a big part of this, and affects your marketability in the future. That league player you're talking about, it's a hassle that whoever has him on the team has to go through, and that means that he's less valuable to teams because they have to pay that expense. Let's talk to you about the independent contractor versus employee issue.
Yeah, so a lot of players are treated as independent contractors, and that means there's not an employment relationship. Typically with an employment, 1099 contractor, where you are responsible for all of your taxes and doing all of that work. W-2 employee, they're going to do withholdings for certain taxes, for unemployment benefits, things like that. You might get health benefits, depending on what the organization has. That's going to really play in as well to whether or not you want to form an entity, because if you're an independent contractor, you could set up a single member LLC, deduct business expenses, have a liability shield provided that you use that entity correctly, but you just want to know which one you are. And if you want to be an employee, and maybe they do have healthcare, that's something that's important to you, you might want to push for that and negotiate in other areas in order to get that. But you want to be aware.
Let's just say it's super rare.
Very rare.
Super rare to be an employee. It's even rare, well, maybe not so rare anymore, but it's rare-ish on other esports, in other esports even still. And as far as the FGC goes,
I have never seen an employment agreement in the FGC.
I would say one.
Really? I'm actually surprised.
It's over now, but yeah. That's probably not going to happen in the future.
Yeah, the only place I've really seen it is in the league. So LCS, Overwatch.
League of Legends, Overwatch.
Yeah, that's really about the only spot.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's some things to look out for. let's talk about a little bit more legal stuff, lawyerly stuff. How long do you have to fix something if you are found to be in breach? So you've screwed up, okay? You haven't streamed for your allotted hours, whatever it is. How long do you have to sort of make that up to the team? This is called your time to cure for breach.
So my main thing is I don't want it to be 0 time, because that means the team could just come to you, you haven't streamed for a day, and they're like, you're out, you're gone. So I typically want like at least a week, if not more. And typically you also want to have some period for the team there as well. Or maybe you don't. Like if you're the player, you probably want to be able to like, all right, I can come to you and tell you to fix it, or I can just be like, I'm out. So, maybe you don't want a cure period for them, but you want to get that cure period for the team as small as possible. You want to get your cure period as large as possible.
I mean, I think that's pretty much shorthand for how the contract should go, right? I mean, from your perspective as the player, you want to have as many rights as possible, and you want to be obligated to do as few things as possible for as much money as possible, right? You're not going to get everything that you want, but that you would rather err, if you could, in negotiations on the side of you having to do less and you being able to get away with more.
Like literally every contract ever, right? Like this.
Yeah, of course.
This isn't even like FGC or esports.
For sure.
Business generally.
Exactly right. Yeah. And speaking of business stuff, indemnifications are in some cases important. And this is in the weeds now.
What's indemnification?
So it's basically saying that if something goes wrong, that you'll cover for it. And so you'd rather not be at risk to have to do that. What if there's some violation of law and it's on you to defend, to pay for a lawyer to defend whatever happened, the team for whatever happened? That would suck.
This is actually going back to the intellectual property clauses. I think those are the biggest places of exposure that players have, is what licenses they've given out when it comes to indemnification, because FGC deals with big game publishers. You're starting to see bigger sponsors come into the place. Like, for example, Team Liquid just teamed up with Marvel and Disney. If you want to talk about a company that takes licensing seriously, I don't think anybody takes it more seriously than Disney. So if you're indemnifying the team for some intellectual property rights that somehow gets into that stream and ends up with Disney, and then something blows up and Disney has to come to the team, you don't want to be on the hook for that. I mean, the good news is you're, probably judgment-proof to some degree relative to what the
compared to
problem
them,
is. But also another good reason that if you're an independent contractor, you set up an LLC to help with the liability shield.
Okay, so you're on this team, right? The contract's great. Everything's awesome. You have joined the team. What do you need to do to maintain that status on the team? It's very common for contracts to include something like a non-disparagement agreement or a morality clause. These are very common. These basically say that you cannot publicly disparage the team. You can't say anything negative about them in public. You can't be a jerk about them on the internet.
How fuzzy is that definition?
It's pretty fuzzy. Yeah. That's...
It's kind of like...
You should err on the side of caution, as the player, in that kind of circumstance. You don't want to give fodder unnecessarily if you don't need to, and you usually don't need to. So that's not disparagement. Morality clause is more about whether... It's not sort of Victorian morality, but that's not the issue. It's are you doing something that lessens the value of you to the team? If you say something racist in public, or if you hit somebody in public, or if you take some action, if you do something that makes people think you're a jerk, like these are things that make you less valuable to the team. And so it's common for contracts to say that if that does occur, then they can drop you, or they can dock your salary, or fine you.
That's part of acting professionally, right? Like, you're supposed to be professional players. So a lot of that comes into, you don't want to, like, some people have brands that are a little bit edgier, they like to talk trash, they like to do those things. You want to double check those things and make sure you clear it with your team as well. If you're that type, you want to make sure you know what the lines are, but it's part of being professional as well. Going back to the non-disparagement as well, one of the biggest challenges I see is because the value of some contracts is small, typically the only leverage you have is going public with what the problem is, right? And there's a big balance on that because maybe there are non-disparagement or confidentiality provisions in your contract that prevent you from doing that. But if there's not, there's also the question of, if I go public with this to try to get leverage, one, is it actually going to get me anything, or is it just going to be this kind of cathartic experience where I can get this all off my chest? But two, is that going to hurt me from getting contracts in the future as well? Like, would it better benefit me to sort of talk to them, say, all right, look, I'm not going to try to take everything out. Let's come to some nice amicable statement. You'll pay me some percentage of this, and then I can go out and get another deal more easily because we've done this. And I can point to this and say, you know, we kept this all quiet. There were some issues, but I wanted to be a professional. You can go to that with your other team. You can show, look, I'm a professional. I can handle these things that way.
I've definitely had experiences where things have gone wrong in a business relationship between a player and a team, and the player really, really, really wants to talk about it in public. And even an instance where a player writes up a whole spiel that they're going to go public with, and it's very detailed. And I really try to get them not do it, but then they insist on doing it. They even tell the other side, I'm about to do this. It was like a Cuban Missile kind of situation, the crisis. And I was sort of expecting to wake up each day, like with my client having been dropped and just being terrible. And thankfully, they sat on it and didn't end up sending it out. But it was very, very close. And that was a big relationship. I mean, that would have been tens of thousands of dollars lost, most likely. So.
Well, good job.
Don't do that.
Yeah, good.
Well, I wasn't.
Good job to you and the player.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Transitioning to that, suppose that the player had done that and the relationship ended. Let's talk about what happens if the contract ends badly, either because something like that happens or there's non-payment or whatever. What are the considerations?
So again, this, to circle back, make sure that you have vetted this organization beforehand. Some are definitely more likely to screw you. I mean, just to be frank, there are some out there that have reputations as teams that don't end up paying, teams that don't give you what they said that they would, teams that don't actually send you around to tournaments as much as they said that they would.
Even household names.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, like even big teams that you would expect to be operating above board, you still run into them. That's why you vet everybody. And honestly, going back to it, I would rather take a handshake deal from a well-vetted team. I would always prefer a contract.
Naturally, yeah.
Always prefer a contract. But I would probably prefer a handshake deal from a well-vetted team that's going to treat you right than the best contract in the world from a team that doesn't honor its contracts.
Yeah, the contract's not going to be worth anything if it's not on.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, all right, things have gone badly. What I want you to do first is sort of organize what happened. You should probably approach a lawyer, but that's not going to be very valuable to you if you don't have, the email history, the chat history that relates to what happened.
The contract.
The contract, of course, is a big part of this, right? So sort of organize in your mind what happened, what the team was supposed to do, what they didn't do. Do you have proof that this didn't occur, or if it's something that they did, that it did occur?
Also, I was just thinking of this because I run into this a lot, and this is general, not just specific to FGC players, but when you come to the lawyer is going to be looking for very specific things in what has gone wrong. Happy to listen to you about all the venting that you want to do, but we're going to be targeting specific things for what claims you might have. And so we might try to organize your thoughts in a particular direction. Don't feel like we're not trying to listen to you. We're just trying to be efficient with your time and ours, and we're trying to make sure we figure out what's going wrong under the law.
Yeah, I mean, having had a relationship drop sucks. I mean, it's to get dropped from a team or whatever that has gone badly. It sucks, and so I understand players are oftentimes very upset, and they may view it as, it's time to get back at the team. And while I understand that, you have to recognize that it's very expensive to go through litigation. It takes a ton of time. It's very draining on you, and you sort of at all times are wondering what's going to happen next, and that could be years, a year, 2 years at the worst. I mean, it takes a lot of time, or can take a lot of time. Even at the lower end of things, it's it's never the case that it gets solved in a couple of days. Never. I mean, I've never had an experience where I've been helping a player get whatever it is from a team and it not take a month. I mean, because everybody's busy, right? The team is busy, the team's lawyer is busy. It's just gonna take a little bit of time. It can't be instant.
Yeah, so again, organize everything in writing, make sure you have it in writing, talk to the lawyer, remember all these considerations. Let's talk about content creation a little bit and just a little bit on forming an entity, which ties in well with that, and then hopefully get to some questions.
Cool, all right. Well, when we're talking about content creation, what we're talking about really is streaming and YouTube. Twitch, I guess you were talking about Facebook earlier. Maybe that's happening now.
Yeah, and Facebook started to pay salaries
yeah.
to content creators, and actually fairly decent salaries, so those are coming.
Okay.
The thing I like about Facebook, just to drop this in, is there's a built-in audience creator. So while they don't have the market that Twitch does, it's going to give notifications to everybody and their mother, probably literally, that you are now streaming.
Oftentimes, agreements from these companies are just form contracts. That is to say, they are just a form that the company prints out and sends to you, and you don't really have space to negotiate. Only at the super fanciest level do content creators have room to negotiate. And if you're not somebody who is, at the top of the charts, then you are going to have to accept what the contract is. But that's not to say that you shouldn't read it and know what it says. You still need to know, as we were saying earlier, what the relationship is going to be.
And that's a good point. Like, I always want my players to read their contracts. I'll read them as well, but I want them to at least read them, so if they have questions I didn't answer specifically, they can also ask those.
Absolutely.
So, you can't necessarily negotiate those big contracts, but, still understand them, still ask your lawyer about them, still run them past the lawyer.
Yeah.
Biggest thing with streaming in particular is IP issues. So for example, using copyrighted music will get your clips on Twitch muted afterwards once they figure that out and they find it. It will get your YouTube videos taken down. There's this thing called the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And there's a whole process for if somebody takes down your video or your content and you respond and say, no, I have license, or this wasn't copyrighted material, whatever, and then basically you're left to litigate it afterwards, more or less. There's a process for that.
Yeah, a lot of us just use copyrighted stuff anyway when streaming. I mean, we're all streaming video games that we don't have the rights to. It's just inherently what we're doing.
There's actually a legal term, it's called tolerated infringement. So you were infringing the publisher's rights, but they tolerate it because you're basically, marketing for them.
So we're all basically doing that to some degree. But if you can, it would be better legally to minimize it. There are other considerations. If you have a stream that's playing 1920s, public domain jazz, that may not be as interesting to potential viewers as a stream that's playing modern music that is for sure copyrightable or copyrighted. So there's more that goes into it. But ideally, I would rather you be not using licensed or unlicensed stuff.
There's also a lot of really cheap music out there, and what do they call it, where you just go and find a bunch of music or stock photos. They have it for music as well, sort of like stock photos.
Yeah.
You can go buy licenses for super cheap to have background music.
I mean, on my own stream, I've found a whole bunch of just copyleft stuff. That is to say, things that are new, but that the rights holders just say anybody can use it for whatever reason. Yeah, Creative Commons and the like, other licenses as well. So that's what I use, but nobody else cares about that. It's just that's ideal. All right, you don't need to do that.
So
you should.
We talked a little bit about creating an entity throughout. Creating an entity, particularly if you're just a solo content creator, until it gets more complicated, you can probably create an LLC yourself. A single member LLC is usually a form that you can get off the state Secretary of State's website. You fill it out yourself, you pay the filing fee, and then you just want to keep up on your annual reports. You want to make sure you have a registered agent, which if you don't want people knowing where you live, you may want to pay somebody else to be your registered agent because those things will be public records. But by and large, you can do it by yourself. Once it gets more complicated, if you start to grow, you need to hire people to do video editing for you or something, then you might want to think about, all right, I want a lawyer to start looking at some things, maybe making me some contracts to contract with other people as well.
Yeah, right.
And then running it through the LLC instead of through you personally.
Definitely, yeah. You want to make sure that it all goes through the company so that you can take advantage of the liability protections and the like. As far as what those contracts may look like, you have to pay attention to who owns the material that comes up with. So say you're using some video editor in order to put your stuff together. You want to retain, well, I guess the LLC really is what it should retain the rights. You want to make sure that these are sort of work for hire things, which means that you will retain the rights. You want to have approval rights, which means that you have the final say as to whether something that somebody's given you is good enough to actually use in whatever project you're working on. And you want to have a clear payment method and schedule, like we were talking about earlier. Always, you need to make sure that things including payment, how long a contract lasts, and what conditions the contract ends in, those all need to be specified every time.
Yeah. Also, if you're starting to build a brand, you might want to think about trademarks. If you have a name that you're known by, a trademark is what identifies the source of services or goods. If you get USPTO recognition, basically registration of your trademark, then that covers you for the entire country. There's a process to go through that. You want to clear it. Actually, that's a really important point. If you're thinking of going out and maybe after your professional career, you want to start a team, before you pick a name, and if you're really going to do this seriously, you want to clear it to make sure you're not picking something that somebody's going to come sue you for. You want to, either go learn how to search the USPTO yourself, or better, hire a professional to do it who can help you to clear those names.
Yeah, that has happened.
Yeah, FaZe Clan. FaZe Clan is a prime example. FaZe Clan, they're not really in the FGC, but a well-known team. They wanted to get a trademark for FaZe Clan with the class of goods that covers apparel. There was already a company called FaZe there, and so they didn't do it, and they kept selling apparel, and then FaZe, the clothing company, sued them. And they settled out of court, which is how most of these things work, but they didn't do any of that clearance beforehand. And unfortunately, that's part of the nature of esports, is a lot of people just start it as a passion project and then later on go back and do the due diligence, but those are some things to think about.
So this is all if you have sort of gotten to the stage in your playing career where it's not just about competing anymore. You're a content creator, maybe you have an entity, maybe you have, or certainly I guess at this stage you have a stream or a YouTube channel or something else, and you've looked at the contracts. But you may also want to find additional stuff. And so in order to do that, one way to do it is just by yourself, pounding on doors, cold calls,
model,
which is what Justin's doing, and he's killing it. But not everybody can do that, both for time reasons and for personality, whatever. Maybe it's not easy for everybody to just cold call. I get it. In those cases, you may want to look at getting an agent, a manager, something like that.
Yeah. Agreed.
Okay, so if you do, this is another situation where you have to pay attention to what the contract says.
And actually, some of the worst contracts I've seen have been agent contracts, reported agents. You want to know how much money they're taking? Do they get a percentage of every deal that you enter into, even if they don't help you with it? For example, because of the nature of the FGC and esports more generally, teams capture a lot of sponsorship rights, and so agents often can't go out and find you sponsorships. So really, the main thing that they're banking on is your deal with a team. And unless they're really going to get you more than the 5 or 10 or 20%, whatever it is they're taking, and you should know that, unless they're going to get you more than that value, what are they doing for you? So I think it's really important that you understand what your agent is doing for you, how much they're taking. If they're trying to source deals for you in California, are they licensed? What are they obligated to do?
Yeah, in my experience, I would say there's maybe one player agency that I've ever told a client that I think it's okay if you sign this contract. It's super rare. I think in general it tends to be one of the more predatory things that happens for players. Theoretically, it's great to have somebody who finds new work for you, right? Finds new deals. That is a great idea. But in my experience so far, that hasn't often happened, that they've actually come back with something that has been actually valuable for my player. And I would say more commonly, it just sort of binds my players in additional ways that they didn't need to be. If, as you said, I think the worst thing that I've seen is when contracts will say that a manager or an agent will get rights or will get paid even if they haven't helped in finding the deal. And I've seen that very commonly, and that's a bad thing to sign.
Yeah. I hope that there is eventually way more money in the FGC because I really think it merits it. I think it's one of the best communities. It's one of the most authentic communities in all of esports. But until there is, I don't see a lot of need for agents either.
I agree with that. All right, one last thing. Immigration law.
Talk to an immigration lawyer if you're going to be traveling overseas to play, or if you're a foreign player coming into the US. Don't just go on a tourist visa. If you're doing that, if somebody's telling you to do that, make sure you actually talk to somebody. That is a big red flag, and especially if you don't want to get kicked out of the country permanently, talk to an immigration lawyer if you're going somewhere else to play.
To be clear, I'm definitely not an immigration expert.
I am also definitely not an immigration expert.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's about all we wanted to chat about. I see we have 5 minutes left. So I think that went a little longer than we had expected.
Yeah.
But are there any questions? Would anybody like to ask us anything? Happy to do so. Please.
Cool, I get a mic.
Yeah, we'll give you a mic. I keep the mic, I hold the mic. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So you guys mentioned that you recommend that everyone does a bunch of vetting before signing a contract, before creating any kind of entity, before pretty much doing anything. And you guys also made the comparison to sports. The thing is, with sports, we all know how much Steph Curry is gonna get paid when he plays for the Warriors, how much each shoe deal is gonna be. And as someone that's in the process of creating their own entity, people aren't really forthcoming when it comes to discussing their esports contract, and it's not really, this isn't really a culture where people discuss it. So how would you recommend proceeding with the vetting? Is there any sort of resource you could check out? What's really the process to get your vetting in order?
So you're right that almost always contracts will have some kind of an NDA that makes it so that you're not supposed to say how much money you make. And it is also the culture even on top of that, definitely. But that is, you can often ask players who are on teams, and in my experience, they've often been okay to talk about it. Now, it's also often been the case that they haven't wanted to be precise, but at least getting a ballpark is something that's useful. And this is about salary. If it's more than that, if you're curious about how well the team has been backing them up in any number of other ways, my experience is that players are much more willing to talk about that side of things. If they have had problems, they will say it typically if they have had problems, even if they're not supposed to. So salary is something that they don't, but the rest they will.
And almost as a follow-up, what's a good resource to find out about a team's revenue sources? You say that they rely often on sponsorships. Where do you go to find these numbers or kind of better relate to these numbers?
So the question is about how you find a team's sources of revenue. You should do as much research as you can. How can you find that stuff out?
If you know, please tell me.
For sure. This is definitely a problem. Yeah, my knowledge on that basically comes from just knowing people over the years. There's not a better individual resource as far as I know.
It's if I've worked on the deals and I've started to become familiar with them. It's anecdotal knowledge at this point.
Yeah.
Yes, and we'll just repeat the question, that way I'm not walking up and down.
So one thing I do kind of know is that players and just personalities will have their own sort of personal revenue source in some way, or like on Twitch, subs and donations and all that. Is there a precedent, or is there a certain thing where like their team would like kind of say, can I get a little piece of that, or other sort of stuff like player merch versus team merch? Does the team kind of want the player merch and all that?
Okay, so will teams take a cut of streaming or merchandise or anything like that? Is that?
Yeah, pretty much.
Depends on the contract. And honestly, it used to be much more common for teams actually to have an agreement directly with Twitch and get a cut that way. Twitch has pushed back quite a bit on that, and so that has largely phased out. And actually, when I see a contract now where they're trying to get into your CPM or into your streaming money, I'm like, this is not typical anymore, and we should push back on this. And otherwise, with the merchandise split, we talked a little bit about that. You can negotiate in that. Teams tend not to be giving as much of that anymore, but that's definitely a point you can negotiate on.
Sort of a follow-up to that, I do know like a lot of like NBA players, like pro sports players, have gotten screwed over by the IRS for not reporting that kind of income.
That actually, so he talked about NBA players getting in trouble for not reporting certain types of income with the IRS. Yeah, let me just say in particular, if you ever say, hey, I got this money, I don't need to pay taxes on it, right? That is the wrong answer. And I hear that a lot. Like, I got paid in this way, that means I don't need to pay taxes on it, right? But first off, talk to your accountant, not me. All I will tell you is that is not correct. Go talk to your accountant.
That sounds right. Yeah. Anybody else have a question?
Last question.
Go for it back there.
With the remote nature of most players, specifically with streaming setups and like that, and the teams being in different states, what does the jurisdiction of the contract fall under?
Okay, so what does the jurisdiction of the contract fall under, considering that oftentimes players are located in places where teams are not located? There may be any number of different business relationships where you're separated, for sure.
Can I just mention my favorite contract ever had a jurisdictional provision in one part of the country, a choice of law in another part of the country, and both parties were in other states than those two as well.
Well, so this Tifu contract that has been in public, right?
Actually, that's
it, right? Yeah. Now, I don't know that that's the real contract or whatever. This is just sort of what's in the allegation. Assuming that's true, then yeah, it does say that it's
like New York.
Yeah, New York, I think Florida.
Washington law, New York jurisdiction, FaZe is in Southern California. And Tifu is in somewhere else. What I will say is generally, and this is not universally true, but in employment or contractor agreements, it is where the contract is performed that is typically the law that applies. Now, I'm not going to say that's universal. California, I'm pretty sure that's the right law. There are other factors that go into consideration often, like where is the contract entered into, but it's typically where are the services performed that is the law that applies. Also, speaking to the NBA player, just going back to that, you really do want to talk to your accountant as well about where you made your money, because NBA players will pay part of their taxes based on where the game was played. They get paid by game. And so if they're in Florida, it's different taxation than they're playing in California. At least that's my understanding. So again, talk to your accountant about that, not me, but that's another consideration to have that would apply to FGC players.
Interesting.
That also applied to musicians that travel on tour.
I would think so, but talk to your accountant.
Yeah, any other questions? Yeah, go for it, man.
So there's a weird thing with a lot of other esports like CSGO and mainly like the Overwatch League versus the greater FGC is that the FGC is, hey, you're playing this game, you're playing that game, and that game. Usually it was mainly Capcom, but now it's Arc System Works and Capcom and SNK. But with Overwatch and also StarCraft, you are dealing directly with Blizzard, and it is their money going in. How much does, like, say, Blizzard have a say in whatever a contract player has versus something like, does NRS have some sort of deal with Sonic Fox?
Okay, sure. So, how much control over player contracts does Blizzard have in the Overwatch League, for example, versus how much control does NetherRealm Studios have when it comes to a Mortal Kombat player or anything else in the FGC? So, Blizzard has a substantial amount of control over that stuff. Their contracts are sort of required to have certain things. It's the same way with League of Legends.
Yeah.
In the FGC, that doesn't exist at all. Doesn't exist at all. There's, as far as I know, I mean, I've certainly never dealt with a contract that is directly between a player and a developer or rights holder, unless it's something like the rights holder is specifically paying for the player to do some promotion or whatever it is.
Street Fighter League.
Yeah, SF League maybe, yeah. That's actually not direct either. But so no, I mean even Capcom Cup, although Capcom, I mean, okay, so I guess one way that you could think of that is that when a player enters a tournament, they have to sort of agree to the tournament's rules, and Capcom Cup has its rules, and so the player by entering will agree to those rules. But I don't think there's anything more substantial than that.
And my understanding as well is Blizzard spun off a league entity for Overwatch League they had told the teams what certain minimums are supposed to go into there, and there are a lot of interesting legal questions that we don't have to get into with that as well. But it is fascinating. Yeah, it really is. And once you get into leagues, it gets much more interesting and complicated. You start talking about antitrust law and other issues as well. But they do have certain requirements. They had to be employment agreements. There were minimum salaries, things like that.
Yeah, we're basically the Wild West. I mean, there's very little in the way of rules overarching. There's no, central board of governance in any way in the FGC. There's no control exercised by the rights holders, or very little anyway. And so, yeah, players can sort of deal with the teams on their own terms, I think almost always.
Thank you all. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, and hey, let us know if you have any questions. If you'd like to talk with us afterward, we're definitely going to be here for a while. I have to commentate in 25 minutes, but if you can hit me before that, let me know.
What are you commentating?
Mortal Kombat.